Blackness swallowed the world, the only light a sliver of moon peeking through storm clouds. The road, a cracked and forgotten ribbon of asphalt, snaked through dense woods, swallowed by the shadows. It was the kind of road that whispered warnings, urging travellers to turn back, to seek the comfort of well-lit streets and bustling towns. But tonight, the road was empty, save for the wind whistling through the trees, a lonely symphony for a solitary soul. The air hung heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something ancient and unsettling. A chill ran down your spine, a primal instinct warning of unseen dangers. It felt as though the forest itself was holding its breath, watching, waiting for the inevitable. This road, shrouded in darkness, was a place where logic dissolved and fear took root. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch sent shivers down your spine, amplified by the silence. It was a place where the line between reality and nightmare blurred, where every shadow held the potential for something sinister. Locals told tales of this road, whispered warnings passed down through generations. Stories of travellers vanishing without a trace, their cars found abandoned, engines still running, doors flung open as if in a desperate attempt to escape. Some dismissed these as mere folklore, the ramblings of superstitious minds, but others, those who had felt the chill of the road, knew better. They spoke of a presence, a darkness that clung to the asphalt, a malevolent entity that preyed on the lost and the fearful. It was said to appear as a figure in the distance, a solitary silhouette beckoning for help, luring unsuspecting souls to their doom. Their whispers spoke of a chilling laughter that echoed through the trees, a laughter devoid of joy, filled only with malice and despair. It was a sound that sent chills down the bravest of hearts, a harbinger of unimaginable terror. The stories were just scary stories, meant to keep children in line and travellers on the main roads, right? Or was there truth to the whispers? Tonight, the road was alive with anticipation. The wind seemed to whisper a warning, a name repeated softly on the breeze. But the name was lost in the rustling leaves, a secret the forest refused to reveal. There was a feeling, an unseen force pulling you towards the heart of the darkness. It whispered promises of forgotten things, of secrets buried deep within the woods. The urge to turn back, to flee from this desolate place, warred with a morbid curiosity, a desire to see what lay hidden in the shadows. The air crackled with an unseen energy, a palpable tension that made the hairs on your arms stand on end. It was the calm before the storm, the silence before a scream. Tonight, the road was waiting, waiting for its next victim. Headlights cut through the oppressive darkness, the only source of solace in this desolate expanse. John gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, his eyes scanning the road ahead. He was late, later than he intended, but work had a way of bleeding into his personal life. The GPS had died miles back, leaving him at the mercy of poorly marked back roads. He cursed under his breath, wishing he had heeded his wife's warnings about taking shortcuts. She had warned him about this road, the stories, the whispers. But he, ever the pragmatist, had dismissed them as superstitious nonsense. Now, alone in the darkness, doubt gnawed at the edges of his logic. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the hum of his engine and the occasional shriek of an owl hidden deep within the woods. Every shadow seemed to writhe, taking on monstrous shapes in his peripheral vision. John tried to focus on the road, on the sliver of light illuminating the asphalt ahead, but his mind raced with unsettling possibilities. He told himself it was just his imagination, fueled by tiredness and the isolation of the road. But deep down, a primal fear pulsed in his veins. He was not alone. He could feel it. Headlights cut through the oppressive darkness, the only solace in this desolate expanse. John gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, eyes scanning the road ahead. He was late. Work had bled into his personal life. The GPS had died miles back, leaving him at the mercy of poorly marked backroads. He cursed, wishing he had heeded his wife's warnings. She had warned him about this road, the stories, the whispers, but he dismissed them as superstitious nonsense. Now, alone in the darkness, doubt gnawed at his logic. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the hum of his engine and the occasional shriek of an owl. Every shadow seemed to writhe, taking on monstrous shapes in his peripheral vision. John tried to focus on the road, on the sliver of light illuminating the asphalt ahead. He told himself it was just his imagination, fueled by tiredness and isolation, but deep down a primal fear pulsed in his veins. He was not alone. The first sign of trouble was a flicker in his headlights, a distortion in the darkness ahead. John slowed the car, squinting through the windshield, his heart pounding against his ribs. There, in the distance, stood a figure, a man, tall and slender, silhouetted against the faint glow of the moon. He was too far away to make out any details, but something about his posture, his stillness, sent a chill down John's spine. The man stood motionless, arms at his side, as if waiting for him. John's first instinct was to drive on, to put as much distance between himself and the figure as possible. But curiosity, that insidious beast, whispered in his ear. What if the man needed help? What if he was injured, stranded? His conscience, that nagging voice of reason, urged him to stop. He wrestled with his instincts, torn between self-preservation and the moral obligation to help a fellow human being. The figure remained motionless, a silent sentinel in the darkness. John took a deep breath, steeling himself. He would drive closer, get a better look. As he approached cautiously, the figure remained eerily still. John's headlights illuminated the man in more detail, revealing tattered clothing and unkempt hair. He seemed to be injured, his body slumped at an unnatural angle. John's foot hovered over the brake pedal. He wanted to help, he really did, but a growing unease gnawed at his gut. Something felt off. The way the man stood so still, the way he never once turned his head, it was all wrong. He rolled down the window, the cool night air rushing in, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and vaguely sickening. John's hand instinctively went to the door handle, ready to flee at the slightest sign of danger. "Hello?" he called out, his voice a nervous tremor in the stillness. "Can you hear me? Are you all right?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't even move. It just stood there, bathed in the harsh glare of his headlights like a macabre statue. John's sense of unease intensified. He needed to see the man's face to gauge his intentions. He cautiously stepped out of the car, leaving the engine running, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. "Sir," John repeated, taking a tentative step closer, "are you hurt? Can I help you?" Still, there was no response. The figure remained frozen, its back to John, as if oblivious to his presence. John's hand instinctively went to his pocket, his fingers wrapping around his phone. He should call for help, he knew that, but the nearest town was miles away, and his phone battery was already dangerously low. He took another step closer, his eyes fixed on the figure's back. The man's clothes were torn and dirty, and John could see what looked like dried bloodstains on his shirt. The metallic scent he had noticed earlier was stronger now, making his stomach churn. "Sir, please," John pleaded, his voice barely a whisper now. "Just turn around, let me see your face." For a moment, just a flicker in time, John thought he saw the figure move, a slight twitch of the shoulder, a subtle shift in weight. A glimmer of hope sparked within him, the possibility that the man was simply disoriented, injured and unable to respond. He took another step closer, his hand outstretched, reaching out to the figure in a gesture of aid. "It's all right," he said, his voice calming now, trying to project an aura of peace, of safety. "I'm here to help." He was close enough now to make out the details of the man's tattered clothing, the frayed edges of his shirt, the dirt ingrained into the fabric. He could see the way the man's shoulders slumped slightly, as if weighed down by an invisible burden. Just a few more steps and he would be able to see the man's face. He could offer his help, call for an ambulance, get the man the medical attention he clearly needed. But as John took that final step, a cold dread gripped him like a vice. His foot landed on something soft and yielding. He looked down. It was a photograph lying face down in the dirt. He bent down, his heart pounding in his ears, and picked it up. As he turned it over, his blood ran cold. It was a picture of him. John. Standing in his driveway, a look of sheer terror etched on his face. And behind him a dark figure, tall and slender, with eyes that seemed to burn with an infernal light. The figure in the road slowly began to turn. John's breath caught in his throat, a silent scream trapped within his chest. The photograph trembled in his hand, the image a cruel mockery of his own terror. His mind, struggling to comprehend the impossible, offered up a cascade of chaotic thoughts, each more terrifying than the last. The figure in the road continued its slow, agonizing turn. Each degree of rotation felt like an eternity, the air thickening with an unseen pressure. John stood rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a fear so profound it transcended the physical. He couldn't tear his gaze away, couldn't even blink, as if breaking eye contact with the approaching nightmare would shatter the fragile threads of reality itself. The metallic scent intensified, now tinged with something else, something ancient and corrupt. It clung to the back of John's throat, choking off any attempt at a coherent thought. His body screamed at him to run, to flee the approaching horror, but his limbs refused to obey, locked in a rigor mortis grip of terror. He watched, helpless, as the figure finally completed its turn, the pale light of the moon catching its face. The figure was gone. The road stretched before him, empty, the only sound the frantic thumping of his own heart. John blinked once, twice, his mind struggling to reconcile the image seared into his brain with the stark reality of the empty road. Had he imagined it? A figment of his exhausted mind, fueled by late nights and his wife's whispered warnings? A cold gust of wind swept through the trees, chilling him to the bone, and he felt a prickle of gooseflesh on his arms. He glanced back at the photograph in his hand. The image hadn't changed. His own terrified face stared back at him, a constant reminder of the horror he had witnessed, or believed he had witnessed. The empty road offered no answers, only an echoing silence that amplified his fear. He was alone, utterly alone, in a place where logic had no meaning, where shadows danced and reality itself seemed to warp and twist. John stood there for what felt like an eternity, his heart a drumbeat in the silence, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and growing terror. Then he heard it. A sound that sent shivers down his spine, a sound that cut through the silence like a shard of glass. Laughter. It wasn't the sound of human laughter, not the joyous, carefree sound of mirth. This was different. A chilling, hollow sound, devoid of any warmth or humour. A sound that spoke of madness, of malice, of something truly evil. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the trees, bouncing off the asphalt, seeping into his bones. John spun around, searching for the source, his heart pounding against his ribs, but there was nothing. Just the empty road, the looming trees, and that terrifying laughter, growing louder with each passing second. The laughter was insidious, worming its way into his mind, wrapping around his sanity like a constricting vine. It was mocking him, taunting him, reveling in his terror. John stumbled back towards his car, fear lending a sudden urgency to his movements. He fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip them. He needed to get out of there, to escape the laughter, the road, the suffocating darkness that pressed in around him. He managed to unlock the car, threw himself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. The laughter seemed to follow him, echoing inside the car, a tangible presence now pressing against his eardrums. He fumbled with the ignition, his heart pounding in his ears, but the engine wouldn't turn over. He tried again, his foot slamming on the accelerator, but the engine only sputtered and died. Panic surged through him, cold and sharp, as he realized the truth. He was trapped. The laughter grew louder, a cacophony of madness that filled his senses, drowning out all rational thought. He beat his fists against the steering wheel, a primal scream building in his chest. He had to get out of the car. He had to run anywhere but here. John fumbled for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. He pulled at it with all his strength, but it was as if the door was fused shut. He threw himself against the window, but it wouldn't break. He was trapped, a prisoner in his own vehicle, as the laughter echoed around him, growing louder, more insistent. Outside, the trees seemed to press closer, their branches twisting, reaching out towards the car like skeletal fingers. The temperature plummeted, the air growing thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. A wave of dizziness washed over him, and John realized with a sickening certainty that something was terribly wrong. He was no longer alone in the car. He could feel it now, a presence beside him, cold and malevolent. The laughter intensified, filling the car, filling his mind. John turned his head slowly, his eyes wide with terror, and looked into the passenger seat. There on the seat lay the photograph. His own terrified face stared back at him, illuminated by the dim glow of the car's interior light. But something was different. The dark figure, the one standing behind him in the picture, had moved. It was closer now, its eyes burning with an infernal light, its lips curled into a grotesque, knowing smile. The laughter reached a deafening crescendo, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Silence descended, heavy and absolute. John's eyes remained fixed on the photograph, his breath caught in his throat. The engine roared to life. The car lurched forward, tyres screaming in protest as it sped down the road, disappearing into the darkness. The headlights cut through the trees, casting grotesque shadows that danced and writhed like demons. And then, silence. The road was empty once more, swallowed by the shadows, the only sound the wind whistling through the trees. John slammed on the brakes, the car skidding dangerously on the slick asphalt. His head spun, a disorienting mix of fear and adrenaline coursing through his veins. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, fighting for control he wasn't sure he had. The road ahead was a blur, the trees on either side a dizzying procession of twisted shapes swallowed by the darkness. It was as if some unseen force was guiding him, dragging him deeper into the heart of the nightmare. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat a deafening thud in the confined space of the car. The air hung heavy, thick with the metallic scent from before, now overpowering, suffocating. John wrenched the steering wheel, trying to regain some semblance of control, but the car refused to respond. It continued its relentless journey deeper into the woods, the headlights cutting through the darkness like a knife, revealing nothing but the endless stretch of road ahead. The laughter was gone, replaced by a low, guttural murmuring that seemed to emanate from the surrounding woods. It was a sound that sent chills down John's spine, a chorus of whispers just beyond the reach of comprehension. He strained to make out the words, his senses on high alert, but the whispers remained elusive, tantalizing him with their implied threat. His eyes darted back and forth, scanning the trees for any sign of movement, any indication of what might be lurking in the shadows. The whispers grew louder, swirling around the car, seeping through the cracks in the windows. John could feel them now, not just hear them, like icy fingers tracing patterns on his skin. They whispered his name, a sibilant hiss that cut through the core of his being, chilling him to the bone. but the car continued its relentless forward momentum, as if driven by an unseen hand. A thick fog began to roll in, swirling around the car like tendrils of smoke, obscuring the road ahead. It was an unnatural fog, thick and cloying, with a strange luminescence that seemed to pulse in sync with the whispers. It clung to the car, seeping through the vents, filling his lungs with its cold, metallic taste. John coughed, waving his hand in front of his face, trying to clear the fog, but it was no use. The whispers intensified, swirling around him, suffocating him. He felt a strange pressure building in his ears, a sense of fullness, as if the whispers were trying to force their way into his skull, to burrow into his brain. His vision blurred, the fog pressing in on him, suffocating him, drowning him in its cold embrace. The car slowed, its headlights barely penetrating the dense fog. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the darkness, the whispers, the overwhelming sense of inevitability that had settled over him. When John opened his eyes again, the car was still. The engine idled quietly, the headlights casting long, distorted shadows through the fog. The whispers had subsided, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow more unnerving than the cacophony that had preceded it. He took a deep breath, the metallic tang still lingering in the air, and tried to orient himself. The fog was so thick he could barely see beyond the hood of the car. The trees, where he could make them out, seemed closer now, their branches reaching out towards him like grasping claws. Panic welled up inside him, cold and sharp. He had to get out of the car, had to find his way back to the road, back to civilization. John fumbled for the door handle, his hand shaking. He took a tentative step forward, his foot sinking into the soft, muddy ground. The fog swirled around him, obscuring his vision, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement in the fog, a shadow detaching itself from the darkness. John froze, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath catching in his throat. It was the figure, taller than he remembered, its limbs elongated and distorted by the fog, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. It stood at the edge of the light cast by the car's headlights, its features obscured by the shadows. But John could feel its gaze upon him, cold and calculating. But the figure moved with unnatural speed, gliding towards him through the fog, its long, spidery fingers reaching out. John stumbled back, his foot catching on a root, sending him sprawling backwards into the mud. He scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding in his ears, adrenaline surging through his veins. But the figure was upon him, its cold, clammy hand closing around his arm with a grip of iron. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. The figure leaned in close, its face inches from his own, its breath cold and fetid on his cheek. John could see its eyes now, burning with a cold, malevolent light, reflecting the depths of the nightmare into which he had stumbled. The figure opened its mouth, and John braced himself for the scream, the laughter, the final, terrifying sound that would herald his demise. But the sound that emerged was neither a scream nor laughter. It was a whisper, close to his ear. A voice that seemed to slither into his mind, wrapping around his sanity like a constricting vine. The fog closed around John like a shroud, its cold, clammy embrace suffocating him, dragging him down into a swirling vortex of darkness. He thrashed against its grip, his heart hammering against his ribs, his lungs screaming for air. But the fog was relentless, seeping into his mouth, his nose down his throat, filling him with its metallic, putrid taste. He caught glimpses of distorted shapes as he fell, twisted branches reaching out towards him like skeletal fingers, grotesque faces leering at him from the swirling mist. The whispers intensified, a cacophony of voices assaulting him from all sides, their words slithering into his mind, whispering promises of oblivion, of eternal darkness. John closed his eyes, his head spinning, his stomach churning. He had lost all sense of direction, of up or down, of reality itself. He was adrift in a sea of shadows, buffeted by unseen currents, pulled deeper and deeper into the heart of the nightmare. He found himself standing on solid ground, the fog swirling around his feet like dry ice. He looked around, his heart pounding in his chest, his senses on high alert. The air was thick with the smell of sulphur and decay, a stench so potent it burned his nostrils. Before him stretched a desolate landscape, illuminated by an eerie, otherworldly glow that emanated from no discernible source. Twisted trees, their branches bare and gnarled, clawed at the sky like tormented souls. The ground beneath his feet was dry and cracked, littered with bones, both human and animal, bleached white by time and some unknown unholy force. In the distance he could make out the ruins of a structure, its silhouette barely visible through the swirling fog. A low, guttural growl echoed across the wasteland, sending a shiver down John's spine. "Where am I?" John whispered, his voice hoarse and dry. The words seemed to hang in the still air, swallowed by the oppressive silence. He reached for his phone, his hand trembling, but it was gone. He had no way to call for help, no way to escape this desolate, God-forsaken place. "You are where you are meant to be, John," a voice whispered in his ear. John spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. But there was no one there, just the swirling fog, the twisted trees, and the ruins of the structure looming in the distance. "Who's there?" John demanded, his voice echoing through the emptiness. "Show yourself," the voice chuckled, a low, guttural sound that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. "You cannot see us, John, not yet." "What do you want from me?" John asked, his voice trembling. "Why am I here?" "We want to help you, John," the voice whispered. "We can give you what you desire most. Power, wealth, immortality." John's eyes widened. "Immortality?" he repeated, the word catching in his throat. "Yes, John," the voice purred. "Eternal life. A life free from pain, from suffering, from the fear of death. All you have to do is accept our gift." John hesitated, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The offer was tempting, seductive even. "What do I have to do?" John asked, his voice barely audible above the pounding of his heart. "You must simply surrender to us, John," the voice whispered. "Embrace the darkness, become one with us." The fog swirled around John, closer now, its cold, clammy touch sending shivers down his spine. He could feel its tendrils reaching out towards him, caressing his skin, whispering promises of power and oblivion. He closed his eyes, his mind reeling. He thought of his wife, his family, his life. Was he willing to sacrifice everything, his very soul, for the promise of eternal life? "No," John whispered, his voice firming with newfound resolve. "I won't do it. I choose life. I choose love." The fog recoiled as if burned, its tendrils withdrawing into the darkness. The fog began to dissipate, revealing a path leading towards the ruins in the distance. John knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that this was his only way out of this desolate place. He took a step forward, his hand reaching out to touch the crumbling stone archway that marked the entrance to the ruins. He could feel the darkness watching him, waiting for him to falter, to give in to his fear. But John was done being afraid. He had faced his fears, confronted the darkness within himself and emerged stronger. He'd made his choice. He chose life. He chose love. With a deep breath, John stepped through the archway, into the heart of the ruins, into the unknown. Dawn broke. painting the sky in hues of grey and purple, a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness that had cloaked the night. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees, casting long, distorted shadows across the deserted road. The air, still heavy with the scent of damp earth and a lingering metallic tang, hung thick with an unsettling silence. A search party arrived, their faces grim, their flashlights cutting through the remnants of the fog that clung stubbornly to the undergrowth. They had been summoned by frantic calls, a worried wife's pleas echoing through the phone lines. John's car had been found abandoned, parked haphazardly on the side of the road, engines still running. Driver's side door flung open, as if in a desperate attempt to escape. They scoured the area, their voices calling John's name, a chorus of concern against the backdrop of the indifferent woods. They found his phone lying face down in the dirt screen, cracked, battery drained. Nearby, a single photograph, slightly damp and smeared with mud, lay as a silent testament to the horror John had encountered. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still there was no sign of John. The investigation went cold, and John's disappearance became another unsolved mystery. His wife never gave up hope. She retraced his steps, clung to whispers and legends. Locals spoke of the man in the road, a malevolent entity luring travellers into darkness. Despite the horror, hope was her only solace. The road remained, a scar on the landscape, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. Travellers spoke in hushed tones of the legend of the man in the road. On certain nights when the moon was hidden and the wind carried the scent of rain, a figure could be seen standing on the side of the road. A tall, slender figure, its clothes tattered, its face obscured by shadows. And if you were foolish enough to stop, you would disappear, your fate forever entwined with the man in the road. John's story became a cautionary tale, whispered around campfires and late-night diner tables. It served as a warning, a reminder that some roads were best left untravelled, some mysteries best left unsolved. And so, the legend of the man in the road lived on, a testament to the enduring power of fear, a chilling reminder that even in the bright light of day, darkness always found a way to linger.